Thank you. Well, thank you, Josh. I don't know, is this microphone, can people hear me? Is recording on. Okay, so I'll definitely speak to the back row then, but pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. Although I'm in the psychology department, I consider myself more of a neuroscientist, and so I'm going to be talking about neuroscience today, and specifically a topic that I find kind of interesting and I think is relevant to the questions about how science and faith relate. Namely, are humans just meat machines? And I want to address this question by talking about the neuroscience of consciousness. So some of you may have heard of Marvin Minsky. If not, he was one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence in the 60s and 70s at MIT. And he made this famous quote, "The brain happens to be a meat machine." And this is a pretty blunt statement, I think, but also I think actually a quite accurate statement of what most neuroscientists believe, namely that our brains are elaborate, complicated, amazing machines. That is, they work according to scientific principles that we should be able to understand in their entirety, and there's nothing transcendent, right? It's all material. So it's sort of a strict materialistic view that everything about human behavior, human experience, ultimately can be reduced to scientific materialism. So, chemistry, physics, biology, and so on. Of course, we as Christians believe that there's more to human experience than just chemical reactions and physics. And I happen to be both a neuroscientist and a Christian, and I've seen firsthand in the field of neuroscience that neuroscience does explain a lot. I mean, it does provide a lot of very satisfying and interesting explanations about human experience and human behavior. But as I'll try to argue today, I also think there are many aspects of human experience that science can't explain, and that I actually think science will never explain, that it just can't, it's outside the realm of science, and I hope to convince you, or at least make the case. So the domain that I want to talk about is the domain of consciousness, because I think it demonstrates both the power of neuroscience, and in particular my part of neuroscience, which is sometimes called cognitive neuroscience, but also its limits. So consciousness, I think we can sort of agree, our subjective experience of the world, seems like something that's somewhat transcendent, that isn't just chemistry, that isn't just neurons firing and so on. And so you might wonder, can neuroscience really make progress in understanding consciousness and subjective experience? And I want to argue, yes. In fact, I'll show you some examples where neuroscience has made a lot of progress in understanding aspects of consciousness and subjective experience. But I also want to argue, no, that there are other aspects of human experience related to consciousness that, in my opinion, neuroscience has made not one iota of progress in explaining. But let's start with the progress first. And I want to begin with a little video to illustrate some of the fascinating situations that neuroscientists run into. This is a guy named Joe who had epilepsy. As you may or may not know, epilepsy is kind of like an electrical storm that typically starts somewhere in your brain and then spreads to other parts of your brain and causes seizures. And hopefully, in many cases, it can be treated with drugs that might help reduce seizures, but in some cases, the epilepsy is resistant, and so more extreme measures are taken, including surgery. And one surgical technique that's sometimes used in epilepsy is called a commissurotomy, where you actually split the brain's two hemispheres in half. So you cut the connections between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, the so-called corpus callosum. And what that does is it prevents the electrical signals from spreading from one hemisphere to the other and helps reduce the seizures that are associated with epilepsy. Well, this guy had split brain surgery, and what's particularly interesting about patients like Joe and other patients who have had split brain surgery is it allows you to ask a very interesting question, which is, so now we've got two brains up here. Do we have two consciousnesses, right? So once we've actually separated the two hemispheres, does the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have sort of consciousness independent of each other? And as we'll see in this video, the answer seems to be yes. So let's take a look.
Seem like that long, does it?
Well,
The collaboration began when Joe had surgery.
and you had this procedure to correct an epileptic problem,
Yes.
is that right?
Trying to stop the seizures. I was having seizures like every day or so, or sometimes 2 or 3 a day.
To control Joe's epileptic seizures, a surgeon severed the connection between the two halves of his brain. Cutting the corpus callosum like this prevented the spread of the electric storms that caused his seizures. But it also prevented the left and right halves of his brain from communicating with each other. In a brain like mine, roughly speaking normal, at least all in one piece, the left half of my brain controls the right side of my body, while the right brain controls the left side.
Oh, no.
But because the two halves are connected,
Nothing wrong with that.
getting each hand to work independently isn't easy.
Okay.
But when Joe is given the same task, his two hands operate as if controlled by two separate brains. What's happening is that each half of Joe's brain is given a separate instruction. He's asked to fix his eyes on the cross in the center of the screen. Anything flashed to the right of the cross goes only to his left hemisphere. Things to the left go to his right hemisphere. Because the two don't communicate, each hand does only what its half of the brain sees.
Wow, look at that. It's really like two different people doing the same.
That's right.
Same
That's
task.
the idea.
Okay, Joe, I want you to keep your hands out in front
In
of
an
you.
experiment that's now a classic in brain research, Mike Gazzaniga over 30 years ago used a similar setup to find out if the two halves of the brain are specialized to do different things.
Ship.
Joe is being flashed a word only to one half of his brain. Words flashed to the right
Storm.
are seen only by his left brain, and Joe can report seeing those words just fine.
Piano.
Good.
But when a word is flashed to his right brain,
Didn't see that.
Okay. Joe, I'm going to ask you
but now watch what happens.
to draw that with your left hand.
You're gonna be lost.
Why don't you try drawing another picture of it over here if that will help you.
Oh, phone.
Oh, okay.
Durr.
It's almost as though somebody has given him a secret communication.
That's
and
right.
now he knows that it's a telephone. But up until then, he was blind to it.
Exactly.
When Gazzaniga first did this experiment, it instantly proved that the ability to speak resides almost exclusively in the left hemisphere. Not until he sees what his right brain is drawing is Joe able to name
He
it.
said church, didn't
After looking at the picture.
he? But he had to figure it out about as long as we did. That's really interesting. It's a picture here of somebody communicating almost with another person.
And the communication is not occurring inside the head, it's occurring out on the piece of paper.
Yeah.
Right, so fascinating case, right, where a word that's flashed to the right side of the world goes to the left hemisphere and he can say it, because the left hemisphere is where language is typically localized. So the left hemisphere is perfectly aware of the word, it can speak it, but then flash a word to the left, it's seen by the right hemisphere, which can't speak, right? Nor can it communicate that information to the left hemisphere. However, it controls the left hand, and so it knows what it was, even though the left hemisphere doesn't. It can draw a picture. Once the left hemisphere sees it, then the left hemisphere can say it. So it really does suggest sort of separate consciousnesses in the two hemispheres. Okay, a few other studies I'd want to present. A couple about levels of consciousness and one about contents of consciousness. So often people who study consciousness distinguish level of consciousness, that is, are you conscious or are you unconscious? For example, are you awake? Are you asleep? Are you anesthetized or are you awake? And versus, say, the contents of consciousness. So right now, for example, you're thinking, hopefully, about this talk. That's the contents of what's in your experience at the moment. But that can change, right? You can think about something else. And so the contents of your consciousness can change. And both of these, the levels of consciousness and the contents of consciousness, have been studied by neuroscientists. So here is a famous so-called positron emission tomography study. This is a technique where you inject a radioactive tracer, a low-level amount, so it's safe, a low-level amount of a radioactive tracer into the person's bloodstream. The radioactive tracer goes where the blood goes, and because it's radioactive, it decays. And so you can put a person in a PET scanner, which will detect the decay of the radioactive particles, which are where the blood is, right? So you can detect where the blood goes while somebody is doing a task. Well, in this study, they actually use this technique to measure blood flow when somebody's awake and when they're asleep, using two different anesthetics. So basically, they had two completely independent anesthetics that would knock people unconscious. And they compared what parts of the brain are more active during the awake state than the unconscious state across both anesthetics. So it's hopefully looking for something, a conjunction of the effects. And what they found was quite consistently across different anesthetics, this area labeled A up here, which is the thalamus of the brain. And these kinds of studies have led many people to suggest that, in fact, it's activity in the thalamus which is critically important to consciousness, the level of consciousness, being awake versus being asleep. The same kind of findings have been reported in studies of sleep as opposed to anesthesia, all indicating that activity in the thalamus is particularly important in being conscious. So just a demonstration that you can actually make progress in figuring out neural correlates, the parts of the brain that are important in consciousness. It's not, magical or something. You can actually see it experimentally. And here is a study on sleep. And in the top two, you see waking versus non-REM sleep. So when we go from awake to sleep, what areas of the brain get deactivated? That's what the purple is. And in the central region there is the thalamus again. When we go to non-REM sleep to REM sleep, when there is brain activity and things are going through your mind, even when you're not awake, you do see thalamic activity. And when you compare REM sleep to waking, you don't see the difference anymore. So this thalamic activity seems to be, again, associated with a level of consciousness. Okay, so those kinds of studies demonstrate that we can actually make some progress in figuring out some of the neural substrates associated with level of consciousness. How about contents of consciousness? Can neuroscience methods make progress in figuring out what somebody is actually experiencing subjectively. And just because this is a cool demo, I wanted to share this. We'll see if it works, because it'll depend on how far away from the screen you are. But give it a shot. Cover your right eye, and then look at the numbers in the top row from 1 to 9. And I'm hoping, depending on how far away from the screen you are, that you may be able to find a spot where that frowny face disappears. If it's not in the numbers 1 to 9, you may need to go further out. But see if you can find a spot where if you cover your right eye and you look with your left eye, like for me, actually it's out here, before that frowny face disappears. So maybe in the back, I don't know if you got to look all the way over there or something, but yeah. Okay, way over here, yeah. Right, so yeah, this is meant to be on a piece of paper that's a foot away from me. But anyway, once you've found the spot where the frowny face disappears, I invite you to look down at the bottom row, the same spot on the wall or wherever it is for you, and notice what happens to that gap, okay? And this is kind of related to consciousness because we all, totally unaware of it, there are holes in our visual field that we are completely unaware of, right? This is the so-called blind spot in your eye. And the reason it's kind of interesting why we have one, it turns out that our retinas are kind of designed backwards, where the axons, or the connections coming out of the retina, actually go forward before they punch through the retina and go back to the brain. So they come forward, and they have to punch through somewhere, and where they punch through, there are no photoreceptors. There are no cells that are sensitive to light. And so in that small part of the retina, you're blind. But what this kind of demonstration shows is that your brain interpolates. It fills in that hole, that blind spot, so that you're not even consciously aware of it, right? Which is, it's a cool demo, and it's kind of related to consciousness, which is what put it in there. Okay, but in terms of scientific studies of contents of consciousness, a lot of studies have investigated a phenomenon called binocular rivalry, which I can sort of illustrate with a few examples here. So in all of these cases here, you can perceive each of these stimuli in two different. So the Necker cube up on the top, you could see that the square on the top left as being in the front of the square or of the cube, but you might also be able to bring yourself to seeing it as the back of the cube, right? And you might be able to actually decide which way you want to perceive it. But you can't perceive it the same way both times. You can't perceive it both ways at the same time, right? You can perceive it one way or the other, and you can actually switch back and forth. Likewise, that picture up on the top right, you might see it initially as a young woman who is turning away from you, who's wearing this big hat with a feather, or you might see it as an old woman who's turned towards you, where the chin of the young woman is now the nose of the older woman, and you see her chin against her chest. So you can actually perceive that picture in two different ways again, but not both ways at the same time. The famous one down at the bottom left, you can perceive that as two faces that are in profile looking at each other, or just as a vase, right? But you can't perceive it as both at the same time. And then down here on the bottom right is an example that's kind of more similar to what's used in typical experiments, where you can sort of focus on the green diagonals or on the orange diagonals, and you can sort of choose which ones to pay attention to. Now, that kind of approach has been used in binocular rivalry studies. So in these studies, you actually present two different stimuli to each eye. You present, for example, maybe that red vertical stimulus to the left eye and that green horizontal stimulus to the right eye. And what's interesting is when you do that, so like if you're wearing these goggles, so your left eye and right eye are seeing totally different things, what do you think you experience? It turns out that what you experience is one or the other, and it switches back and forth. You do not perceive both simultaneously. You perceive one or the other. There's a rivalry between the two eyes. That's why it's called binocular rivalry. Now, this is a very cool experimental setup because you can present exactly the same visual stimulus. It doesn't change in any way, and yet conscious experience does change, right? Sometimes I'm perceiving the red, sometimes I'm perceiving the green, and so my conscious experience is changing even though the visual input isn't. So people have used this to try to understand the neural correlates of conscious experience per se. Right, so in binocular, you don't perceive a combination, you perceive one or the other, and what you perceive switches, even though the visual stimulus doesn't. So here's a very famous experiment that used this. Monkeys were trained to indicate with a lever what they were seeing, what they were perceiving. So in this case, it was motion. So when they saw motion going up, they were supposed to pull the right lever, and when they saw motion going down, they were supposed to pull the left lever, okay? And they got trained to do this over months, and they got very good at pulling the correct lever depending on whether the motion was going up or not. Now, there are neurons, brain cells, in this area here in pink and blue. This is the so-called MT area, which is very responsive to motion. And if you record from neurons in this area, you will find neurons that are tuned to specific directions of motion. So if you record from one neuron, it'll fire when things are moving up. You record from another neuron, it'll fire when things are moving down. Okay? All right, so what I'm showing here is the response of one particular neuron. So there's a lot going on in the slide. Let me walk you through it. Up in the top left, you see the so-called receptive field of the neuron. That is, what parts of the visual field it cares about. And in this case, it only cares about things really close to the fovea. That is what you're focused on. Stuff moving around out here, it doesn't matter. But if it's getting motion near the fovea, this cell's going to fire. Okay? Now, with the next thing, that little radial plot with the angles, that indicates how much the cell fires depending on which direction the motion is moving. And so the diameter of that sort of circular thing on the top indicates how many neural spikes or how many action potentials this neuron is firing at a time. So if you present it with a 90-degree motion, that is, I guess in this case, probably motion going up, it fires a lot, okay? If you're listening to that cell firing. If you present motion going down, there's nothing. It doesn't fire. And similarly, motion to the right and left, it doesn't fire. If you present motion going mostly up and a little bit to the right, it'll fire, but not quite as much. Okay, so that indicates that this cell likes motion up. That's what makes it fire, and it's got to be in the middle of the receptive field. Okay, now let me walk you through this super cool result over here. So what we're showing here now is in a binocular rivalry situation where one eye is seeing motion up and one eye is seeing motion down. And on the left is when the monkey reports seeing up, and on the right is when the monkey reports seeing down. But the visual input is exactly the same, right? Visual input hasn't changed. The subjective experience of the monkey has changed. And each of these little dots here indicates the cell firing, okay? So every row, there's a bunch of rows there which are different trials where we're presenting the stimulus, and the monkey's reporting up. So you can see a whole bunch of dots because the cell is firing a lot. We made a little histogram down here of how much the cell is firing, and you can see it's firing a ton when it reports up. But the very same cell, when it's seeing the very same stimulus, but now the monkey is perceiving down, doesn't fire very much. Okay? So what this shows is, man, we're actually seeing a neuron here that is responding to the contents of consciousness, whether the monkey is experiencing motion up or motion down, not the visual input, because that doesn't change, right? Just the contents of consciousness. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that neuroscience is making real progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. We're starting to understand which parts of the brain are most important for being conscious versus unconscious, like the thalamus is particularly important, it seems. And even the contents of consciousness, like here's a cell that responds to moving up or moving down, and you can imagine the same kind of thing for seeing red versus seeing green, or even feeling a particular emotion or something. Now, these kinds of questions, what are the neural correlates of some conscious experience, have sometimes been referred to as the so-called easy problems of consciousness by a philosopher named David Chalmers. Easy doesn't mean easy. Easy doesn't mean like it's trivial to answer the question. What it means is that it's possible, in principle, to answer the question. Okay? So you can imagine experiments that could answer these kinds of questions. In fact, I've shown you some, right? So you can design experiments to figure out what neural activity corresponds to seeing upward motion, what neural activity corresponds to being awake, what neural activity corresponds to feeling love, for that matter. Science is making clear, and I think exciting progress on these kinds of questions. And although I didn't describe it, it's also true that you can also even manipulate people's conscious experience. So neurosurgeons actually do this all the time. There are some famous cases where, if you have to do brain surgery on someone, you typically don't want to take out parts of the brain that are crucial for language, for example. So neurosurgeons will often stimulate parts of the brain and have people try to talk and see if it messes them up and things like that. But they've also found that sometimes if you stimulate specific areas, it evokes memories. Like people will say, oh, wow, I just got this experience of, walking through this gate into this yard. And, so we're manipulating that person's conscious experience by stimulating particular parts of the brain. But again, according to Chalmers, these are the so-called easy, or at least addressable, problems of the science of consciousness. So what are the hard problems of consciousness? So these are not questions about what are the neural correlates, but how could neural activity give rise to mental experience, to subjective experience? Why is it that, this activity in these neurons in MT makes me feel like I'm experiencing upward motion, or makes me feel like I'm seeing red, or whatever? This is sort of for philosophers in the room, it's the mind-body problem. How can physical stuff, neurons firing, give rise to non-physical subjective experience? And one of the key problems here is that we're talking about first-person experience. It's not third-person data that I can actually look at and validate and confirm, right? It's my own experience that nobody else has, right? I don't know what's going on in your mind, and even if I could record from your neurons and so on and maybe predict what's going on in your mind, that's different than having the experience that you're having. So given a complete account of all the objectively measurable third-person data, like which parts of the brain are active, there's still another question. Why is all, firing and electrical activity and so on, why is it associated with conscious experience? It doesn't seem like it has to be. Why is it? So the point is that explaining third-person data doesn't suffice to explain this first-person experience. Now, let me give you some philosophical thought experiments to try to drive this point home. Here's a famous one from the Australian philosopher Frank Jackson, which is sometimes called the knowledge experiment, I think it's called. So Mary is a 23rd century vision scientist, and she's been studying color vision her whole life. And in the 23rd century, let's assume, we have solved it, essentially. We've figured out all the neural correlates of color vision that you could possibly want to know. And Mary knows all this. She knows exactly what activity patterns correspond to seeing red versus seeing blue versus seeing green. She's built computer simulations that simulate human color vision exactly and predict everything that people claim to so on. And she can even manipulate people's brains to make them see red or see blue or see green or whatever. But here's the kicker. She has lived in a black and white room her whole life. Okay? Her whole life. She's read all these books, she's done all these experiments, but she has never actually seen color herself, right? And the question is, if she gets to walk outside, does she learn something new about color vision, right? And most people think, well, yes, of course. I mean, in fact, she's learning the most important thing about what it's really like to experience color. But the thought experiment sort of points out that there are facts about consciousness, about conscious experience, that can't be deduced from all the relevant scientific knowledge. I don't care how much you have, it's different than experiencing the subjective experience. Or to put it in Chalmers' terms, even if you answer all the easy problems, all the sort of feasible scientific questions about the neural correlates of different conscious experience, that still doesn't address the hard problem, which is how does subjective experience arise from physical matter in the brain? Some other thought experiments, famous ones from philosophy that kind of illustrate similar points. Suppose I ask you to prove that what I call red, you experience the same thing. So when I see red, I have an experience of it. I sort of know what it looks like. Let's say, just for sake of argument, that what I call red, my experience of red is actually your experience of blue. And your experience of blue is my experience of red. But we've switched the names consistently, so even though I call this blue and you call it blue, my experience is what I think of as blue, and your experience is what I would think of as red, right? Is there any way that I can sort of tell scientifically that our subjective experience is the same? Yeah, the neural correlates might be the same, and I might be able to predict, yeah, you're going to call it blue, but are you experiencing the same thing or not? Is there any way scientifically to rule out that possibility? Or consider the problem of other minds. How do I know for a fact that you really are conscious, right? And how do you know for a fact that I am, right? Is there any way to prove that, everybody else is just a robot, right? Everybody else in the world is they're not really having subjective experience, but of course they adamantly claim that they are, right? But because that's what they're programmed to do as these robots. But is there a way that you could prove that somebody else has subjective experience, right? Yeah, you can look at their neural correlates and you can find the brain cells that fire when they say they're seeing red and when they say they're seeing motion upwards and stuff like that. But that's different than knowing that they're having the subjective experience of seeing red or the subjective experience of seeing motion. And then finally, the matrix argument, right? The brain in the vat argument. So if you've ever seen the movie Matrix, most of the people were actually being artificially stimulated to think they were in the real world, when in fact they're just in these vats, right? And they're having their brains stimulated. How do you know that's not actually happening to us, right? How do we know for a fact that what we're experiencing is really, the real world out here, as opposed to, somebody's just stimulating my brain to think I see this room and think I see all these people and all this stuff, right? Can science actually rule out that possibility conclusively? Okay, so just a few take-home lessons, then I'm happy to lead a discussion and answer questions. So what I hope I've convinced you of is that science is making real progress in discovering the neural correlates of consciousness. We can do brain imaging studies to identify parts of the brain that are active when people are awake versus asleep. We can do single unit electrophysiology in animals to look at which cells are firing when certain contents of consciousness are present and so on. And so I think it's actually reasonable to think that eventually we're going to be able to map between the brain and conscious state pretty accurately, right? That we'll be able to take somebody's brain activity and maybe even make a movie of what they are experiencing subjectively, right? In fact, there are currently fMRI studies. This is a technique for imaging the brain where you can actually decode. So based on somebody's pattern of activity during this scanner, you can decode what part of a movie they were watching, right? So it just seems like it's inevitable. Eventually, we're going to really figure this mapping out pretty well and be able to, predict quite accurately what people are experiencing based on neural activity. And a little scarier, but I think also probably inevitable, once we understand exactly the neural correlates of consciousness, we will be able to manipulate them, right? We already can to some extent, but we could, certainly in animals and hopefully never in humans, but we could, make somebody experience something. We could be the matrix machines, stimulating somebody's brain to make them experience something eventually, right? That's all the easy problems, right? Not easy, but addressable at least. But nevertheless, at least in my view, I don't think we've made any progress at all on the hard problem. I really don't think we've made even the smallest step in understanding this mind-body problem from philosophy. How can physical matter give rise to non-physical mental experience? That, to me, is a complete mystery. And I mean, there are plenty of people who claim that they think they have an answer, but I have not seen a satisfying one in my view. How could the material give rise to the immaterial? And I guess my point of view is that the question may just not be a question. It may be outside the realm of science, because the way science works is we study third-person verifiable data, right? Everybody has to be able to collect this data and see it, right? And that's just not the way subjective experience is. I don't have a way to measure subjective experience itself. I can measure the correlates of it. I can't measure the subjective experience itself because it's not material. It's not something I can actually measure, and science can only study the material, right? So this argument, I think, applies to the study of consciousness, but I think the same argument applies to many other aspects of human experience. I mean, consciousness is a great example because science has made a lot of progress, but I think actually the more progress we make, the clearer it becomes that we haven't started making any progress on the hard problem. And so I think, yeah, we may make progress on the neural correlates of love, hope, faith, spiritual experience, and so on. That, to me, takes none of the mystery away about why we experience love, why we experience hope, why we have faith, why we have spiritual experience. Personally, I think they're outside of the scope of science in general. And I'm happy to stop there and take any questions. Thank you.